the darkness deepens, Lord, with me abide. When other helpers fail, when comfort cease, help of the helpless, oh, abide with me. Swift to its close ebbs out life's little day. Earth's joys grow dim, its glories pass away. Change and decay in all around I see. O thou who changest not, abide with me. I need thy presence every waking hour. What but thy grace can for the tempter's power? Who like thyself my guide and stay can be? Through cloud and sunshine, Lord, abide with me. I fear no foe, with thee at hand to bless. Ills have no weight, and tears no bitterness. Where is death's sting? Where, grave, thy victory? I triumph still if thou abide with me. Hold thou thy cross before my closing eyes. Shine through the gloom and point me to the skies. Heaven's morning breaks and earth's vain shadows flee. In life, in death, O Lord, abide with me.
Thank you, Sue. Welcome all to this celebration of life for Gerry Stephenson. Before we begin this part, just one housekeeping note. If you've not silenced your cell phones yet, please do so now. In this room will be people who knew Gerry through many different avenues. There will be people who knew him exceptionally well over decades of friendship, and there will be people who spent one very enjoyable day with him on one of his mine tours. There will be a complex web of emotions in this room on this day of recollection and thanksgiving and farewell, emotions that will change as we hear various stories and tributes. Please know that each one of you and all that you bring are welcome in this place. It is my hope that we will create safe space for one another and make room for tears and laughter and outright marvel at a life so broadly and fully lived. I invite you now to join with me in a time of prayer, acknowledging the broad range of beliefs among those of you who have gathered here. Please take these words and hold them in ways meaningful to you. So let us pray. We gather here, Holy Source of life, with thanksgiving for the varied, wondrous gift of life and for the well-spent, well-shared gift of this man's life. We spend a few moments now recognizing any distractions that may have come with us today and releasing those distractions to be fully present to this time. We open ourselves here and now to one another and to you. We thank you, O God, for the gift of legacy, for the ways that the things important to us will live on in others, thinking this day of the immense legacy of Gerry Stephenson. His friendship, his knowledge, his passion for the natural world, which continued to grow all the days of his life. His love for his wife, Avis, and daughter, Glennis. His unique ability to be forthright while maintaining a twinkle in his eye. And all the ways that his legacy has found a place in our hearts. These are things for which we offer our gratitude. We know, O God, that our lives are interconnected and that you intend it to be so. On this day, when the nation remembers the sacrifice of those impacted by war, we place this gathering in that context. We bring to mind the many places in this world that Gerry called home, and we pray for the current needs in those places. And as we recall a life that has reached its earthly conclusion, we commit ourselves to support those most impacted by his passing as they mourn this loss. And we pray that we will add our energies to the causes that were dearest to Gerry's heart. O God of all lands, all peoples, all creatures, God of earth and sea and sky, we entrust this day and this life and this time of thankful remembering to your care. In Christ we gather and pray. Amen.
I'm Jennifer, and Gerald was my big brother. I'd like to introduce you to the brother I knew when I was young. When I was 5, Gerald was already 17, and our brother Harry was in between. We lived on the coast in the north of England. Lots of coal mines around, and we lived very near the beautiful lakes and rivers and mountains of the Lake District. Gerald's interest in fishing really began during our annual seaside holiday in North Wales. The beach wasn't Dad's scene at all. He was bored stiff. So, to keep everyone happy, we spent the day on the beach, and in the evening, we rented an old, wooden, very leaky rowing boat. And we rowed out to sea. We each had a hand fishing line and one tin to bail the water out. It was Gerald's job to bait the fishing lines and to keep all the ragworms at his end of the boat. A ragworm is, as it sounds, it's a worm with lots of legs down each side. Not very nice. But usually one or two escaped and floated in the water down to the other end of the boat where Mum and I were sitting. Poor Mum couldn't swim, and she hated these ragworms, and she felt very sick because it was quite wavy. But she came with us every single evening, and it was so exciting catching the fish from the seabed and then taking them home for dinner. Gerald loved the rocky coastline in this area, and he had his own special places to go fishing from the rocks. Every Christmas, we visited our grandparents. And as Gerald was the oldest grandchild, he got the preferential treatment from our very severe and rather frightening and very Victorian grandfather. Gerald heard his first opera on our grandfather's record player. And back home, he would open the bathroom window while he was shaving and perform one or two arias. I think he thought perhaps the neighbours would enjoy it. And even now, when I hear those two arias, I see Gerald's face covered in shaving cream. Our grandfather was also chairman of a well-known rugby club. And this club was actually top of the league at the time. And of course, he took Gerald to the rugby matches. They had a prime position, and afterwards, Gerald could meet the muscly, muddy rugby players, and I'm sure that was very exciting for Gerald. He played rugby at school and at university, and the Stephenson nose, as we called it, which was quite prominent, got broken twice. Our brother Harry was fanatic about photography and rock climbing. And one winter, there was a light covering of snow on the highest mountain in England, which was actually in the Lake District. So Harry persuaded Gerald to leave his fishing rods behind and try skiing. They bought some wooden skis and they fastened them onto their boots with leather straps. And they had a very energetic few days, sliding, but not always in the right direction. At home, Sunday morning was the highlight of the week for me, because I would pop into Harry and Gerald's bedroom, and we would play Tarzan on the bed. I got thrown up in the air, and Gerald and Harry bared their chests and made the Tarzan jungle call. And Mum and Dad could hear that brothers and sister were enjoying time together, so they turned a blind eye to the metal springs which were popping up through the mattress. My first trip to the cinema with my brothers was to see King Kong. And Mum gave Gerald strict instructions to look after me and to explain to me that this King Kong guy was really quite friendly and quite gentle. Older brothers are often a measure of safety. So Gerald did a good job there, and I coped with seeing King Kong on the big screen. But back home, just as I was dropping off to sleep, the bedroom door opened, and a deafening King Kong roar came from Harry. Dad kept hens, and it was Gerald's job to feed them. We had a very small house, no central heating, and in winter there was ice on the inside of the windows. And we had just one hot water bottle between the three of us. So I went to bed first with the hot water bottle, and then when Gerald came to bed, he would slide his hand under the bedclothes and take out the hot water bottle for him. But if Harry got there first, he would slide his hand in, tickle my toes, and make hen clucking noises. And my husband John can confirm that even to this day, very occasionally, I sit up in bed and cry, "There's a hen in the bed." In later years, my husband John and I and our children all enjoyed Gerald's visits. We sledged on garbage bags in Switzerland, and we sailed our boat with Gerald on the south coast of England. And we went to various operas and plays which were broadcast by satellite to the cinema. These are some of the memories I like to keep about my big brother. Thank you.
Glennis, Jennifer, family and friends of Gerry, it's an honor to stand up here to say a few words about a great guy. The Stephenson family came here in 1968, so we'll go back to that time. And I'll be honest with you, Mr. and Mrs. Stephenson didn't make a big impression, but how I can remember this really easy is you go to school in 1968, and this blonde-haired lady comes in a mini dress, gorgeous, which happened to be Glennis. You don't forget the family. When they first came to move, they moved into the miners' executive cabin on the river. And that was a very popular place for the horseshoe people to hang around with and hide and play hide and seek and that. And every so often we'd get a ladder, go up from the canal before they put the dike in, and then go up and then go inside and play. And I got to know Mr. and Mrs. Stephenson very well. And they were very, very, very patient with us miners' kids. I was talking to my dad, and the best way to describe Mr. Stephenson for sure is he came to Canmore in probably a unique time, because 1968 was kind of a turning point for the Canmore mines. They had signed a contract between 250 to 300,000 ton of coal required for the Japanese market. The mines were kind of in a, I wouldn't say quadrant, but you had basically the Wilson team running, and then you had to look for more coal, and there were some mines being driven, but Gerry's job was to go and look for coal, and he was able to do that with a couple of strip mines and be able to fill in, start a couple mines, and the list goes on and on. And by that time, of course, Dillingham started coming in and looking, and from there, the history went with, of course, Dillingham taking over. So I always argued with Gerry because I always thought that, and he said this with due respect because he helped me a lot, and I'll tell you about it. He's a capitalist with environmental movement. He was able to balance both. He understood that you needed to make money to be able to balance the environment, and that's what probably made him so unique. Is that, of course, creating strip mines along the down the road, they became some of the best places. I know people will talk on that later. They blended in the community very well. I know they became very good friends with the Fitzgerald's families, and Dave was telling me how they try to water ski and all those stories, and it's quite interesting. So they blended in very, very good. And to a time when you look at Canmore, it was basically a mining town, pretty redneck, and not a lot of, in fact, you had to go to the dentist. There wasn't really much services here. So to blend in, to adapt, they did very, very well. I think Gerry describe him as I got older and got more involved with Lafarge and got more involved with the community, I found that he was actually an amazing person. To be that extroverted, kind, and patient, and have that mindset to be able to take something and just be able to focus and change it so quickly was just remarkable. If you go back to, for those who were born and raised here, when we had the big flood, they put a dike in. And they put this dike in, and it was actually too big of a dike, if that makes any sense. So the dike that's in the horseshoe or going across the bridge was probably 2 feet too high. And Gerry and a few group of people actually calculated that that dike would cause more problems and harm to the town of Canmore, the size it was, than it would be if it was brought down to a smaller size. So hence, believe it or not, they were able to scrape 18 inches off the dike, which also helped the view of some people too, but the main reason was that that's the kind of guy Gerry was. He was able to take something and study it and take on a government and get that changed, which we always thought would never happen, but it did. He also was a big supporter of me in a lot of ways to help me as on some issues. He was a visionary. He had actually looked at taking methane from the mines and piping it over to Lafarge. So that's a project that didn't go very far. It was a good vision, but he was always thinking about ways to help the environment, and it would have helped both causes if that problem would have gone through. Obviously, the methane would have been worked from the plant to burn, and basically it took away the methane going into the atmosphere. The other thing that amazed me was his building skills, because we let him take some sandstone from our quarries, and of course he built a house that Michelangelo would be proud of. Maybe even more than Michelangelo. He had a passion for mining. There's no way to describe the passion for the mining. I can't. When you look at what he did for the community and the museum and the history, I wish I had a core of that passion. Hitting the tours and going back and helping people and mentor and telling what Canmore was all about. Totally amazing. I mean, we talk about it, but he lived it. He lived that passion for the community and mining. He kept it alive. And he's just a great, great guy. And he also was so involved in the environment with fishing. He was involved in everything. And he just was meticulous of what he did. And I could call him up at the end and ask for help. And I actually got his view on another thing with Lafarge. We built this tunnel, and I had trouble with a mining engineer, which happened to be from England too, so I thought those two would get along really well. And he actually helped me out. So he was always there if he needed him, but he's brilliant. And, you know, his passion too for Mrs. Stephenson was unbelievable. I always had the opportunity of playing Santa Claus at extended care for many years. And I'd see Gerry there beside Avis. Just a man that was, you know, when he passed away, I was really, really shocked, because like 4 days prior to that, I was talking to him at the lodge, and it really hit me, just because, not because we're really close friends, it's the fact he was a guy you could talk to and you could always phone up and get some advice. Last year on council, we had a few fights over development, but we'll put that aside. I always told Gerry, I said, for every hole an engineer dug, an engineer can fill that hole, right? So that was our always internal joke. So we had some difference of opinions, but very professional, always supported what we wanted to do. He supported the mining community. They were involved in the mining community. He belonged to organizations, associations, you know, and I think if you go, the quote that basically to end this day is, the true measurement of a man is how he treats someone who can do him absolutely no good. And that would be Gerry. He treated everybody equal, whether he be a coal miner, shoveling the coal, to the president. And you should be proud of his accomplishments, Glennis, ever in this community. He made a difference for so many different people in so many different ways. Thank you.
My name is Geoff Jordan. I hope I've got this microphone working. And I'm a geologist, and I was a very good friend of Gerry's for a long time, and his business partner. And I want to thank you for the opportunity to come and speak to you this afternoon about my experience with Gerry. And I want to talk about some of his background as a mining engineer and important aspects, I think, that relate to that. My first significant interaction with Gerry came in late 1978. He was pulling together a group of people to form a new mining consulting company in Calgary. He'd found, working independently, that people didn't take him seriously, which is hard to imagine in Gerry's case. I was glad to be given that opportunity. There were 5 of us who started, 4 engineers and 1 geologist. And as I said to Gerry right from the word go, now I have you all surrounded. So that was the kind of relationship that we had. He was a good friend. The company was called Norwest Resource Consultants and was formed in March officially of 1979, although we'd been working previously together for at least 3 months before Christmas of that year. From the very beginning, Gerry set the tone for the standards of ethics and technical excellence that he expected. You couldn't imagine being driven by more serious concerns over issues, especially safety. The thing about Gerry is he always appreciated just how dangerous the mining environment is. But he also knew that no one else around him who doesn't have that personal experience did know. And it was up to him to make sure that they were protected and the rest of us to do the same thing. We were there whether we liked it or not. At first, the plan was to have a consulting company working out of Calgary on various mining projects. But in the first and the Great Recession of the 1980s, which I'm sure many of you remember well, it became obvious that we had to expand into international areas, other areas of activity. Gerry had contacts with the World Bank, and he used them to get Norwest invited onto the bid list for projects in developing countries, some of which were pleasant and some of which were not so pleasant. I know I was on some of them. One of the projects that he was successful in getting was called the Ombolan Underground Coal Mining Project, and it's located in West Sumatra in Indonesia. Gerry was really proud of the success that we had in getting awarded that contract because the key reason, as he told me with a smirk many times, was that he'd succeeded in doing that against BMCL, British Mining Consultants, who were a former employer of his. I smiled in return. At the same time, Gerry led the formation of a new company in New Zealand with some people that he'd met there before, geological consultants there. And we formed a 50-50 joint venture partner and prepared feasibility studies and presentations for the government located in Wellington. I don't know if Gerry took the time out to go fishing on any of those trips. There's one very important aspect that few people know or understand about Gerry's professional background, and it has to do with the oil sands industry. Gerry's engineering skills were never constrained by conventional wisdom or by boundaries of his personal engineering background as a coal mining engineer. He was always attracted to the oil sands deposits as potential targets for underground mining activity, and he was confident that he could address those issues. In the mid-1980s, Gerry was working as an independent advisor to an organisation which is part of the provincial government called AOSTRA. He and another engineer who was working in the same kind of capacity, Roger Butler, who was a reservoir engineer, got together in order to make a proposal to AOSTRA for the development of what was known as the UTF, the Underground Test Facility. This was an experimental project that was intended to support the work that the government wanted done to find more efficient and economic means of extracting bitumen from the oil sands. Roger and Gerry got together, and they, in their proposal, they intended to gain access to the bitumen by being underground, not on the surface. Gerry provided the concept for the design of the UTF and the access systems. This is sinking a shaft and driving tunnels in the underground, whereas Roger did the design work for the wells and layout for the extraction of bitumen. This was a radical idea. Nobody had thought of this, mainly because it wasn't oil and gas industry people who had thought of it. So they couldn't imagine going underground. As one of them said, but how will this work? You're going to be drilling upside down. Well, it turns out that coal miners do drill upside down in the normal course of events. When they put this proposal to AOSTRA, it was fought tooth and nail by the oil and gas industry, but AOSTRA decided that they were going to support the project and go ahead with it. It was the proof of concept for a system which many of you will have heard of called SAGD, S-A-G-D, which means, that was a term coined by Gerry and Roger, steam-assisted gravity drainage. And gravity drainage is down into the tunnels. The idea was to inject steam, bathe the bitumen with heat, liquefy it, have it flow down and to be collected in the tunnels. Over the objections of the oil and gas industry, the AOSTRA went ahead with it. And I can still vividly remember that when the drilling was first being done and the first results of the production were coming back, it was unbelievably exciting because they discovered that their estimates of the production rates way understood what was going to happen. The bitumen was flowing at them so fast they couldn't keep up with the drilling needs for more wells. And that proof of concept has been taken by the oil and gas industry, and they credit themselves with the success in inventing the system. Today, it's hard to find any recognition for the original design work for the UTF, and certainly none of Gerry's contribution to it. So I'd like to set that record straight. Gerry had other concerns. As you've said, he is concerned about the safety of people and people around him. He knew better than most just how dangerous working in an underground mine environment is. Every day these miners go to work, their lives are threatened. One of the things that's not well known is that he had a particular concern for the hazard due to dust. Coal dust is one, but grain dust can do the same thing. It's got a nasty habit of exploding very severely. At one time, for the Westray mine, he was asked to do a review by one of the investors of the mine. He did so, and he was concerned that not enough effort was being put for dust suppression. So he advised them of what they should do. His advice was ignored, and if some of you will remember, not that long after, there was a major explosion at the Westray mine that killed many people, the miners who were there. It was one of the major disasters, and it was preventable. You will have, all of you have seen Gerry's concern for the natural environment and for his restoration and rehabilitation work. Quarry Lake is an outstanding example of beautification, and Gerry does get credit for that, and so he should, because he took it on himself to promote that idea and to get it done. I think it's not so easy to appreciate that all of those golf courses out there, he was very much involved with the layout of those. What you don't realise is the extent to which underneath the ground it's pretty severely undermined. So having a golf course there is a low hazard system that you can have in place, and it's a very attractive asset rather than a serious liability. Gerry's efforts through the program of the mine tours and the museum are targeted towards people. They're not about the mining industry. His concern for the welfare of people was paramount. He was always worried about that. But he could find ways of doing things that you wouldn't necessarily normally expect. He always makes it interesting and exciting to find out what he's saying about and to learn about the hazards of mining. He had tremendous concern for people, for public in general, but in particular for the people who live here in Canmore and for the visitors who come here. Thank you.
Geoff, could I just begin by removing your doubts about Gerry on those trips to Wellington? I can promise you he was fishing on every one of those trips because he's described to me in great detail all the fish he caught. I think it is so fitting, folks, that we can gather here today on Remembrance Day 2019 to remember, to celebrate, and to honor our great friend Gerry. One of the things that Gerry and I loved to do was watch rugby games together, and we've been doing that a lot real recently. And we always had a little bit of a problem because Gerry's and my favorite part of the rugby games were always the national anthems before the game started, and they were so emotional, and Gerry and I would both have tears coming down our cheeks before the game even started, so please bear with me today. Many of you may not know, Gerry's and my relationship got off to a rather rocky start at first. You see, during my career in the States, I had often been invited to be a guest on various fly fishing shows. And Gerry had seen a couple of these shows, and when he heard that I was coming to Canmore, he had visions of me bringing a whole world of fly fishermen along with me. And I'm sure they weren't visions, they were probably more like nightmares of his favorite secret stream, sort of maybe looking like Johnson Canyon or something on a summer afternoon. One of the things that I like to do at this time of year, early in the morning with a cup of coffee, is sit down and tie some flies. And I've been doing that quite a bit these last few weeks. It's my time each morning of prayer and reflection, and I've given a great deal of thought to the time that I had privilege to spend with Gerry. I roughly estimated I've had privilege to fish with Gerry somewhere close to 150 days in these last 15 or 16 years since we retired to Canmore. And I can share with you the privilege has been all mine. I'd just like to begin by describing Gerry in the simplest way that I know how. He is the finest gentleman that I ever met in my life.
Thoughts come to mind for me when I think of Gerry. I think historian, mining expert, environmentalist, lover of the arts, exceptional gardener and pond creator, #1 customer at the thrift store, Canmore Jewel, and my best friend. I already miss our tea times at his kitchen table. He made me feel like I was the most important person. He did that for people. In particular, he helped me through the loss of my dad last year and my mother a couple months ago. He was truly a second dad to me. I willingly helped him prior with his loss of his beloved Avis. And whenever I was away caring for my parents in the States, Gerry was the first person I called on my way home. Sorry, honey. I'll miss our weekly dinners together, if not at our house, at our favorite Spice Hut, and he'd have his favorite shanty, half a beer and half a Sprite. He was our family. We always shared the holidays together and special occasions. Gerry's wife, Avis, was the cook in the house, but after Gerry lost her, he had to learn his way around the kitchen. Once he found the kitchen, he quickly began hosting dinner parties with one of 4 rotating dinners that he would prepare himself and serve on those famous piping hot plates. Would we get steelhead trout, lamb, Lancashire hot pot, or a curry? Karsten, I know you're here. Remember the time the oven caught on fire and the smoke alarm went off? And that was all before we had dinner. And then, of course, it would be followed by dessert, which was his favorite. Would we get his famous homemade lemon crepes, or maybe raspberries with ice cream, or if we were really lucky, a queen's pudding? But one thing I won't miss is having to clean up his kitchen after, because I'm pretty sure he used every pot and pan in the house.
I'm sure with this wonderful group gathered here today, we could collectively come up with so many words to describe Gerry. I'm sure we could come up with dozens, if not hundreds. But in these last few weeks of reflection, I've decided to just choose 4 that for me are the 4 words that best epitomize my friend Gerry. The first one is wisdom. Oh, Gerry had so much wisdom, and we all know that's very different from intelligence, right? We've all met a lot of intelligent people. Gerry was that too, but oh, he had wisdom. There's an amazing passage in the scriptures about wisdom that I reread just a few days ago in the book of Kings. It talks about the scenario is this: Israel's greatest king has just died, King David, and his son Solomon has ascended to the throne, and Solomon is young and inexperienced, and he realized that. And Solomon got on his knees, and he prayed to God, and he asked God for wisdom and discernment. And God was so impressed that he made Solomon an incredible promise where he said, there will be no man before or after any wiser than Solomon. Hence the phrase we all know as the wisdom of Solomon. I'd like to humbly suggest today that Gerry Stephenson was very high on that list of wisdom. Now, Gerry's wisdom was acquired through what I believe to be experience. He didn't read that in a book. And one of Gerry's most amazing stories to me was the story that he would tell quite often, that I'm sure many in this room today have heard. When Gerry was a young man, just 28 years old, with a young daughter and a young wife, he took a job in the north of India at the age of 28. How many of us would do that? Gerry had a real spirit for adventure. So after taking a long boat ride, arriving at Calcutta, taking a train ride to the coal mines in the north of India, upon arrival, Gerry is informed that the head person running these several coal mines had just passed away, and Gerry, at age 28, I want you to think about that for a moment, at age 28, was in charge of, I believe, 5 schools, 2 hospitals, 4,000 coal miners. And I love the one story he used to tell shortly after arrival. They were living in a little bungalow, and he described how these Marxist, Sikh, kind of tough guys, coal miners, they were constantly going on strike. And he said one day they were on their horses and they started going around their little bungalow, and his wife Avis was shrieking, thought they were going to die because these guys were chanting, "Death to Mr. Stephenson." And Gerry turned to Avis and he said, "Honey, I think we're going to be okay." And she said, "What are you talking about?" And he said, "I don't think they're gonna kill us, because I don't think they'd be calling me Mister if they were gonna kill us." Yes. So Gerry's wisdom was gained through baptism by fire. And I love the way Gerry used to dispense his wisdom so gently. Often, a few years ago, when our two sons were in high school, he, as Kay said, was part of our family, and Kay would confide just about everything to Uncle Gerry. And he would often listen, like let's say when our boys were in high school and we're dealing with a kind of a normal high school situation, and Gerry would listen always very carefully. He was a wonderful listener. And he often wouldn't say too much, but he'd often come back a day or two later and bring up that subject and say, "You know, I've given great thought to that. And what if you approached Austin or Doug like this?" And it always worked. He was so wise. And I just want to share my last thought on wisdom with Gerry. Kay read me the most moving thing that was on Facebook just a few days ago. Many of you all know Gerry's favorite place on this planet was the South Island of New Zealand. And Gerry would often talk about who he believed to be the finest fly fishing guide on the planet. His name was Stu. I met Stu just briefly in Canmore a few years ago, had a meal with Gerry and Stu, and there's only a few things I knew about Stu. Firstly, that he was this amazing fly fishing guide. Gerry had fished with many other guides in New Zealand and around the world. He said no one could touch Stu. And secondly, he would often say Stu had more than his fair share of personal problems. So Kay reads me this Facebook message just a few days ago from Stu, and he's writing to the fellow fly fishing guide community in New Zealand, many of who knew Gerry. And you would think this story would go something like, "I'm sorry that I've just heard I've lost one of my dear fly fishing clients from Canada. He was a wonderful old gentleman who told some great stories, and he was really funny and also a very gifted fly fisherman." But it wasn't like that at all. Stu very eloquently and finally described, and I had tears rolling down my face. He said, "Gerry Stephenson changed my life." Gerry's wisdom had the power to change lives.
In recent years, Gerry enjoyed his role as a film star in many movies, from The Band of Brothers, The History of Coal Mining in Canmore, to Learning from Experience, A History of Development on Three Sisters Undermined Lands, his cameo in fly fishing in Living with Wildlife, and one of his favorite fly fishing films, 100. He was disappointed, though. He never did get the call, the one he was waiting for from Hollywood. Gerry was the best historian and storyteller, which shined in his 7 years doing mining history tours with over 1,000 people in attendance, even if they did last 4 or 5 or 6 hours. And his favorite was going to the many classrooms in the valley to educate our children.
The second word that I would describe Gerry with is honor. Now, the word honor, I think in our modern society, to a large degree, has somewhat become, sadly, a forgotten word. Gerry was a throwback from a different era. I think back to the medieval days when young boys at a young age were trained for many, many years through a page, stage, and ultimately to become a knight. And the whole idea of that process was focused on the word honor. Gerry had tremendous honor, and it would show up in the simplest things. I know my fly fishing buddy Mike's here somewhere, Mike Lindsay, and we used to laugh because Gerry, he was so honorable, he always wanted to take his fair share of rowing the drift boat down the river. Now, Mike and I kind of knew that Gerry knew how to row the drift boat down the river, but rowing the boat down the river and rowing so the other two anglers can actually catch a fish is a whole different level of rowing. We didn't ever have the heart to tell Gerry that, but we used to make up excuses. Oh, it's a little windy right now, Gerry. You just keep fishing. Another one was a group of us a few years ago were going down to Montana every year, 9 of us in 3 trucks and 3 drift boats, staying in a house. And I used to tell Gerry, you have one job on this trip, is to be ready every morning at 7 o'clock. We'll take care of all the rest of this stuff. And Gerry had so much honor, he couldn't live with that. And one year he said to me, okay, I'm done with that. He said, I'm cooking a meal this year. So I kind of rolled my eyebrows and thought, oh, this isn't going to be good. He brought pots and pans. It was going to be one of his famous curries, all the spices from Canmore. And our whole philosophy on this trip was to keep dinner simple so we could focus on catching lots of fish. So that day, I had to drop Gerry off at lunchtime so he could go back up to our house and start preparing for this curry dinner. And later that night, my friend Mike, his responsibility in the group was he always cleaned up after dinner. And late that night, Mike came to me and said, never again. My favorite story that I think best describes the honor that Gerry had was when he recounted his many stories, Geoff, of the times you referred to, his 25 years or so at Norwest. Never did Kay and I ever hear him talking about how big any of the contracts were that Norwest signed or how much money they ever made. There was one thing in that 25-year time frame in his life that he was most proud of, and it was the time when the Alberta economy went down the tubes for a long period of time. And he would tell us with great pride, many of you have heard this story, of how they really tightened their belts and they never laid a single person off during those times. He was most proud of that.
One honor I shared with Gerry and others was our weekly meetings with a group we called Flock for the Love of Canmore. When we were awarded the prestigious Ted Smith Award in 2017 from Yellowstone to Yukon for collaboration with concerned citizens and the Stoney Nakoda Nation for protecting wildlife connectivity in the Bow Valley. Gerry was extremely proud of this award and was passionate about preserving and protecting the environment, especially with viable wildlife corridors and habitat. And this certainly was a rare combination, being a coal miner and an environmentalist at heart.
The third word that I'd like to describe Gerry with is humor. Gerry was simply a funny guy. He found humor in just about every situation. I remember a couple of years ago, we had a wonderful fly fishing evening at Art's Place, and Gerry was kind of the MC for this evening. Many of you were at that evening. And when the evening was over, of course it went much longer than it was supposed to, our youngest son, Doug, and some of his buddies, young guys all in their mid-20s, were sitting hiding in the top row. They're all young, aspiring fly fishermen. And after the evening was over in the lobby, Doug and his buddies came up to me, and Doug said to me, he said, "Dad, your pal Gerry is sick." They were quite amused by his stories. One of my favorites was a few years ago. Kay she told Gerry, she forbade him from going fishing alone because she thought that was rather dangerous. Well, I can tell you, Gerry used to disregard that quite regularly. And one day he had to confess. He was forced to confess. He calls us and he says, I'm sorry, but I went by myself down to his favorite river, the Highwood River. And you see, Gerry used to wear this fly fishing vest from England. And inside was a special sort of self-inflating life jacket that was obviously at his age a safety feature if something bad happened and he ended up in the water. So he described what happened this day. He said it started to rain really hard and all of a sudden my vest went off and he said, I was like that Michelin man. I couldn't move. I was standing there for the longest time. And he said, I'm just calling you to tell you that. My last favorite funny story about Gerry is probably the favorite story I've heard Gerry recount so many times, was on his first trip ever to Canmore, when he came over for 3 days from England to interview with the Canmore mines. And they showed Gerry around the mines for 3 days, and he spent most of those 3 days with Walter Reaver. And at lunch on the final day, Walter finally offered Gerry the job as the chief engineer of the Canmore mines. And Gerry, very politely in his honorable way, he told Walter, I really appreciate the offer, but I'm sure you'll understand, I have to go back home to England to discuss it with my wife, Avis. And then right before Walter was taking him to the airport in Calgary, Walter said, one more thing, Gerry, I'd like to show you. And he stopped him. You see, Canmore only had about 1,000 people and a dirt main road, and it was just down from the bridge. And he said, there's a lot there near the river. Just walk through the woods and take a look at it. If you do decide to take the job, you can buy that lot for $500. So Gerry says he went through the woods, popped out to the most stunning view of Canmore. You all know where it is, right where Gerry and Avis built that beautiful stone house. And I just love the way this so describes Gerry's humor. He comes back to the truck to Walter and he says, Walter, I've been thinking about it and Avis is gonna love it here.
You could always hear a pin drop when Gerry presented at the Town of Canmore public hearings. And he always got more than the 5 minutes allotted to the rest of us. But he used to blame it on not being able to hear the buzzer, but I think council always afforded extra time, as what he had to say was most valuable to all of us. And being cautious, not to get political here, one thing I know Gerry would want as part of his legacy in Canmore is for us all to remember that there is no such thing as 100% mitigation of mine workings. In fact, he was determined that there should not be any development on the unfinished golf course at Three Sisters because of the extremely severe undermining risks that he knew to exist there.
My fourth and final word to describe Gerry is the word passion. I've never met anyone in my life who was so passionate about so many different things. I mean, how do you explain rugby and Shakespeare and coal miner and conservationist? He was passionate about so many things. But far and above, Gerry's greatest passion was fly fishing. He's the only person I've met in my life who fly fished for 70 years. We had so many wonderful memories together, and just some simple little silly examples that describe Gerry's immense passion for his love of fly fishing. At least 3 times in our fly fishing endeavors all around the world, I thought we were goners, I can tell you. Once in Chile, once on the Kananaskis Lake, and once on the Bighorn River. You see, for Gerry, he had already come to terms with all of that. He was perfectly happy if his last day was on a fly fishing river. I wasn't quite there yet, I can tell you. He's got to be, I would bet, the only guy on this planet who ever bought his first fly fishing drift boat at 78 years old. My friend Mike and I were like, Gerry, what are you doing? I've got a drift boat. Mike's got a drift boat. We take you fishing all the time. Why do you need a drift boat? He said, oh, I've always just wanted to have one. You know? I remember in the early days of our relationship, it may quite possibly have been the first dinner at his house, and we were just getting to know Gerry. And at dinner, he told Kay and I this story. We didn't know this. He told us how him and Avis had owned another home just down the street from the home they were living in, and he had just sold it a few weeks before, and you can imagine, in Canmore for a nice tidy sum. And he said, you know, I was just up in my office this afternoon, and I was doing some rough calculations, and he said, the way I figure it, he said, that's at least 27 more trips to New Zealand. Another simple thing that described his passion, in that 150 days or so that I had privilege to fish with Gerry, and many of you in this audience have had that privilege as well, never once was he ever the person who said, can we be done now? I'm kind of hungry. It was always me. And this was when he was in his late 70s and late 80s. He would never, ever quit. And I'd like to end today and just recount one of my favorite stories with Gerry that I know was so special to him. I see Gary and Louise Ellington, and Gerry and I, just a few winters, 3 or 4 winters ago, Gary and Louise have a place in Patagonia and Chile, and they were nice enough to host Gerry and I for a month. And Louise would cook us these great dinners every night, and that was even amazing, okay, because every night after dinner, Gerry would quietly tell me, he said, I'm kind of tired, and I may have to take the day off tomorrow. Next morning at breakfast, he'd tell me, I've showered, I've stretched, I'm ready. We fished 30 days straight in Chile. While we were there in Chile, Gerry had set this all up. We hired a guide one time, and we left Gary and Louise for a week and traveled a whole day. Actually, that was the only 2 days we didn't fish were our two travel days. We drove about 8 hours further south to a river Gerry wanted to show me. And a few days later, we were with a Spanish-speaking guide on the Cochrane River. It's a big river, very, very powerful river. And we've been going up and down the river, fishing in different spots on this guide's jet boat. And about mid-afternoon or so, the guide pulled the boat up on a gravel bar in the middle of the river. And I want to just describe this scene to you. So Gerry, I always told the guide to stay with Gerry. They started fishing out into the main part of the river, and I started fishing on the smaller channel, which was about 30 yards wide. And against the shore on the far side was a massive cliff. And I caught a few nice fish quite near to me, and out the corner of my eye, up against the cliff, there was a very small eddy, about 2 feet in diameter. And occasionally I'd see this fish rise in that little eddy. And after studying him for a while, I began to realize this was a big fish. So I called Gerry and the guide up to me, and I explained to them what I had seen. And then the guide saw it. And he had very broken English, and he used the word grande in there. And I said, Gerry, this is your fish. And he looked at it, and he said, no, there's no way I can cast across that 30 meters of fast-flowing water. He said, you catch him. I said, no, this is your fish. So he tied on a special little fly. And now, you must keep in mind, Gerry had been practicing all these years for this occasion. 65 years of practice, all the books, everything he had read, this was his moment. And I explained a few things to Gerry. I said, hey, pull out a lot of fly line. I said, the only thing we have going for us is the fact that water is so fast, if you land short, we probably won't spook the fish, and you can have another cast at him. So Gerry, he was a beautiful, elegant caster, and he went into his 3 false casts and let it go. And he had told me, he said, I can't see this tiny fly. I said, don't worry, I got it. And I said, ooh, that's about a rod length short. I said, pull out the whole fly line now. And he wound up, second try was about 3 feet short. Finally, there's a very advanced technique we use for certain situations that I won't get into now, but we call it a double haul. I said, Gerry, you need to double haul to give that line that little extra bit of speed to get it there. Third cast, he unloads that little tiny black ant, lands about 2 inches, bounces off the cliff, sits in that little eddy for a split second, and I see this giant mouth open and eat that fly. I screamed at him. I said, set! And that fish came leaping out the water. 20 minutes or so later, Gerry landed that monster rainbow trout on the bottom of the island down by the gravel bar. That was the happiest I ever saw Gerry in my life, because he understood, much like the final scene in that Hollywood movie, if any of you have seen it, A River Runs Through It, where Brad Pitt defies all laws of nature. That afternoon in Chile, Gerry defied all the laws of nature, and I think he actually walked on water that afternoon in Chile. And Gerry actually pulled that off twice in his life. The other time I wasn't with him, but is that amazing brown trout on your program that he was so proud of. I know Gerry walked on water in New Zealand that day as well. But I'm so grateful for the privilege of the time that I've got to spend with Gerry. It's easily the most meaningful time in the 16 years or so that Kay and I have been in Canmore, was all the hours that I got to spend with Gerry Stephenson. And I know my tears of sorrow in time will turn to joy as I remember the amazing person of Gerry Stephenson.
Just have a little more. Gerry and Walter Riva had a vision to create Quarry Lake, and Gerry was in charge of the reclamation. Gerry's very last post on his Facebook page was on October 16th, and it was about Quarry Lake and the changes that are being recently proposed. Gerry would want me to take this time today to summarize what his post said. He wrote there were several items included in the proposal that he felt would negatively affect the natural look of the lake and the surrounding area, noting that the natural look of the lake is what the vast majority of surveyed residents stressed was the aspect of the park that they valued most highly. He worried that many of the proposed changes were also certain to increase the number of people already using the park, especially the lake, when the park was being loved to death, in his words. Gerry had offered some thoughts for significantly improving the plan while keeping the lake and surrounding area in a natural-looking state. In brief, plant more trees instead of building picnic structures. No pier. Add a proper beach area with sand over gravel at the southwest corner. No diving board. Let people jump off the cliff I left for that purpose. And used the design of the parking lot to limit the use of the area. Gerry was quite upset about the proposed changes at Quarry Lake, and 5 days after he posted this on Facebook, Gerry was gone. Many people have reached out to me about the idea of trying to get Quarry Lake to be renamed to something like Stevenson's Lake. But I know Gerry would not want that. He would want it to remain Quarry Lake. 5 years ago, my husband and I did propose placing a rock tribute and plaque that we designed to honor Gerry at Quarry Lake. But unfortunately, we weren't successful in our efforts. In celebration of Gerry's life and his many positive impacts that he's had in our community, we're seeking the community's support for creation of a memorial to Gerry. Perhaps we could try again to get approval at Quarry Lake. As Gerry quoted often, "Action this day," as a British politician of some renown used to say. I had let Gerry read the words that we hoped to place on the tribute, and they brought him to tears. So I'm going to close with those words from the proposed plaque, as follows. Gerry arrived in Canmore in 1968 as the chief engineer of Canmore Mines and later the assistant manager. There was a population of 1,000 people. No paved streets, and he bought 170 feet of Bow River frontage for his home for $500. At the end of the mining era, Gerry and Walter Riva had the vision to seal off the outlet of Canmore Creek No. 3 strip mine, and Quarry Lake was created. He contoured the reclamation so that the cliffs and beaches and attractive topography surrounded the lake to produce one of Canmore's favorite recreation areas. Gerry is a jewel of Canmore, devoted husband, a loving father, the kindest friend, a historian giving Canmore mining tours, defender of wildlife, preserver of community spirit, and most importantly, a lover of the outdoors and an avid fly fisherman, always willing to offer wisdom to those of us in need. Gerry's famous for quoting Winston Churchill, and he lives by this quote, "We make a living by what we get, but we make a life by what we give." Thank you, Gerry, for giving us all the gift of knowing you and calling you our friend.
It's always hard going last. I think half my stories have been told already. I've been very moved by everything I've heard said about my dad. Not just today, but from so many people since I arrived back after his death. It shows to me that family is not just a group of people with common ancestry. Family is what my dad had here. And what some very special people have done in organizing this celebration of his life today shows how much he was loved. Rachel and Doug, Glenn, Christy, Pat, Sue, and above all, Gary and Kay, daughter number 2. I like to think that my dad is watching and loving all this. In fact, with a captive audience of this size, he'll be sorry he wasn't here to tell a few stories. I feel so privileged that he was my father. There's not much point, though, in me telling you how wonderful he was, what a good man he was, or what he did for the environment or the community. Most of you could tell me so much more. But perhaps I can tell a few last stories about him, and some that come from the old Canmore days, when there wasn't a smoothie in sight, and Paul's Pizza Palace was the cool place to hang out. There won't be many of you in the room that will know this Canmore, I imagine. But before I get to those, first, I'd like to read out some lines of which my dad was very fond. And they're lines that we reproduced in the obituary. And some of you will probably be tired of reading them by now, but I hope you'll humor me, because these lines from Robert Travers' Testament of a Fisherman, to me, this is not just about fishing. It encapsulates my dad's whole attitude towards life. I fish because I love to because I love the environs where trout are found, which are invariably beautiful. Because trout do not lie or cheat, and cannot be bought or bribed or impressed by power, but respond only to quietude and humility and endless patience. Because I suspect that men are going along this way for the last time, and I, for one, don't want to waste the trip. My dad didn't waste a minute. I've never met anyone so enthusiastic about life, so determined to wring every drop of joy out of every experience. Not surprisingly, when he died, he had 3 trips booked. One to Chicago, another to the UK and Spain, and of course the annual fishing trip to New Zealand. I think his cousin Paul hit the nail on the head when he wrote that, though saddened by news of Gerald's death, I was heartened by the realization that he'd left this life never having known old age. One of the things that made Dad happiest in recent years was, and you've heard about these already, of course, giving dinner parties. He loved to entertain, to have a group of people around the table enjoying good conversation, and of course that captive audience for his stories. And he had that set of party pieces, the Lancashire hot pot, the prawn cocktail, the frozen peas, etc., etc. But the dad that I'm more familiar with couldn't even boil water. Mum did all the cooking, and she did get a little fed up at times. So when we first moved to Canada from England, she was very pleased to discover the, to us, highly exotic frozen food known as chicken pot pie. It seemed simple, she thought. Surely even Gerry could handle that if she left him to make his own lunch. Stick it in the oven at 350, leave it for 45 minutes, and there you go. What could possibly go wrong? Mum returned from a shopping trip with Lena Fitzgerald a few hours later to find a kitchen full of smoke and a very nasty burning smell wafting out the door. "Well," said my dad, "you should have told me to take it out of the box." A lot of my memories of my dad in those early Canmore days also involve the Fitzgerald family. And he and Maurice Fitzgerald, although very different people, were great friends. And when it comes to stories about my dad, Maurice could have told a few real dillies. The one I think he would have particularly liked to tell, I'm going to tell for him. And it involves La Boheme and one of their fishing trips, because this was one of the few times he really managed to get one up on my dad. My parents had a motorhome, and the Stephensons and the Fitzgeralds would go off together, Maurice and my dad, taking it in turns to drive. As a lot of you will know, my dad loved opera, but, well, it wasn't entirely to Maurice's taste, to say the least. Every time it was Maurice's turn to drive, Dad would stretch out and put in an opera cassette to listen to. But on this particular trip, something went wrong. Maurice took over the driving, Dad pulled out La Boheme, put it in, and suddenly the motorhome was alive with the sound of the mamas and the papas. Dad pulls the cassette out, he looks at it, he shakes it, he puts it back in. Mamas and the papas. Then he looks over and he sees Maurice's mouth begin to twitch, and he twigs. And Maurice had steamed, of course, the label off the Mamas and Papas cassette and put the one from La Boheme on it. Another opera-related memory I have is when Geraldine Brooks and I, Geraldine was my best friend, we went to London when we were about 17. And my dad was over about the same time on work business. So he treated the two of us to an evening out, a trip to the opera to see Carmen, followed by dinner in a Spanish restaurant, complete with flamenco music and dancing. Geraldine and I were so thrilled. We spent ages in the Oxford Street top shop, choosing just the right outfits for the evening, and we thought we looked pretty hot. This was not the best plan. Dad, as he told me later, got some very funny looks when he walked into the Royal Opera House with two 17-year-olds in evening dress on his arm. But we didn't notice. We just thought it was fabulous. It was great to have my dad to ourselves and to feel swish and grown up. Then it was off to the Spanish restaurant, and that's when things went downhill. We'd barely got our coats off before the flamenco dancer was swishing her skirts and edging her way over to our table to clap her castanets in his face and claim my dad's attention. So there we sat in pursed-lipped disapproval while Dad sat with a big grin on his face throughout dinner. I tell that story because, as some of you may have noticed, my dad was always, right until the age of 88, what is sometimes referred to, I think, as a babe magnet. Maybe it was the English schoolboy floppy hair, or maybe the boyish grin. But I think it was mainly because, as well as being a great talker, he was also a great listener, always willing to give you his undivided attention and to make you feel at that moment that you and your concerns were the most important things in the world to him. Dad loved opera and theatre, particularly Shakespeare, and I'll treasure the memories of us going to Stratford Festival together for a week each year after my mum could no longer accompany him. And we had some fabulous times in London too, as long as I kept him out of Spanish restaurants. But Dad was just as happy watching a game of rugby or listening to the Goons or Morecambe and Wise. He had no airs and graces. He was down to earth and never impressed by affectation. A story my mum used to like to tell concerns a time they went to a very posh restaurant, full silver service, white tablecloths, hovering waiter, not the kind of place they usually frequented at the time. There was one particularly embarrassing moment when my dad put his usual milk and 2 sugars in his cup of tea before my horrified mum could explain to him that it was the consommé. The hovering waiter, of course, looked down his nose, but my dad didn't care. In fact, I think that's why, when his sole à la meunière arrived, he asked for some tomato ketchup. That's probably enough for me, but I'd like to end with the words he often used to joke he'd like to see on his gravestone. Gone fishing, hopefully upstream.